Welcome to the Communicationdiva podcast, episode 5. Today's podcast is a feature interview with Wade Lifton, a colleague of Jen who recently completed a program at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, British Columbia called A Semester in Dialogue. The course participants are young leaders who focus on subjects which include group process, engaging with others, group learning, and careful listening. Vancouver, eh? Here's a shout out to all those universities in Ottawa, Washington, D.C., London, and other seats of government. Have we got a program for you?
Hey everybody, welcome back to Communicationdiva. This is Jen Swanson, and I am happy that you are listening. This is the podcast that explores all areas of communication in the hopes that something that you hear will be helpful in order to deepen the relationships that you have in your life. I wanted to tell you about where I am today. I am at the Vancouver School of Theology, which is on the campus of the University of British Columbia. And I am sitting in the building that is affectionately called the Castle. And this is a very old building. And for those of you who are not from the Pacific Coast here, 100 years old and older is, and a little bit older is very old to us. And I know the European listeners will laugh at that. But it is a beautiful building, and it's all been renovated. And some of the classrooms are very distracting because they look out onto the ocean and the mountains. And so this is where I am today for this interview. And I have my featured guest with me today, Wade Lifton. And Wade is a student of theology here who is interested in social change. He has a background in group leadership with people of all ages, and he has just finished doing a semester at the Simon Fraser University in a course all about dialogue. And so I'm going to say hello to Wade, and thank you for being here.
You're welcome, Jen.
And I just wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the course you just finished taking.
It's called the Semester in Dialogue at SFU, and it's a program that really focuses on the group process and the group life of what's going on as a way of learning. The Mark Winston, who founded the program, said he might have called it a semester in engagement, and it's really about looking at what engages us in learning. And so there were guests who would come in to speak with us, but trying to stay away from some of our typical models of learning where they would lecture, or where even if we would be in conversation with them, trying to avoid just simple question and answer, but actually trying to be in dialogue as a group with this person as part of that dialogue and bringing something particular to that dialogue. And over the course of a semester, there were 16 of us who were in the course together, really practicing that process together and learning day by day as we practiced it, how to listen, how to engage, how to pay attention to what's going on in the group, how to hear someone's idea and then try and build on that, rather than all of us just throwing our ideas into the middle and trying to get out our own ideas and thoughts, but really trying to build a dialogue together. So the theme of the semester was religion, spirituality, contemplative inquiry, and social change. And so that was the focus in some way of all the dialogues that we had, but it was as much that process of learning that I learned from, and that really helped integrate the content that we were focusing on as much as anything.
Great. So that sounds like a course I'd like to take sometime. It sounds really good. I know for myself, being in small groups sometimes, that it is different than being at the front and lecturing and just talking. What are some of the challenges and some of the benefits maybe of working in a group as opposed to a lecture setting?
I think the big thing is you have a group of people, and trying to draw on the wisdom of all those people, and one of the emphasis in the program was around stories and how we learn from stories, and often we come to learn in a sort of like, I'm an empty vessel, fill me up with information and facts and history, and there's value in that, and we need to, and that can sometimes really help move forward our thinking, but we actually need to engage the thinking, and then we can really draw on what we know about that. Once we have an idea or something that we're talking about, realizing, what do I know about that? Oh, what does this person know about that? And stories allow us to engage what we know in a different kind of way. I think it probably uses a different kind of our brain and a different kind of our being. And often we remember stories, and remember experiences and the feelings and the images that go with that. And those will stay with us. So as a form of learning through story is a way that really helps us integrate and use learning, sometimes more than trying to hold on to a whole bunch of information.
Yeah, I think that's true. Sometimes people work a lot better on, or remember the stories better than they remember just, facts and evidence. Were you learning to be a facilitator in this situation, or was it about group learning just, in general?
Facilitation was part of it. So we all took turns in facilitating a dialogue and welcoming a guest and practicing what that was like. But it was also learning that a facilitator is there to try and help hold space for the conversation, but that really all of us are doing that. All of us as participants were paying attention to what was going on, trying to notice who's speaking, who's not speaking, how much have I spoken. So trying to sort of raise our level of engagement as participants, and so that the facilitator is less trying to steer and shape and direct the conversation, but that we're all in that together. But you have one person who is particularly trying to pay attention to that and hold that space for the group. And that doesn't mean either that they have to make all the decisions or know everything about what's going on. Sometimes it was just that person's role to just stop and say, I notice we're not particularly engaged right now. Are there any ideas about what could be a next step? And so just someone who's there to sometimes ask the question.
Good. So what happens if you're not the facilitator and you're in a group setting? And I'm sure this is familiar to some of the people out there, that you're in a group setting and somebody who's not in charge seems to be taking over. What are some of the things that maybe you talked about as far as how to work through that if somebody is taking over or monopolizing the group?
I found that it really depends on the situation. And so you have to, there are a lot of options. So you have to kind of read the situation based on who this group is, who the person that may be dominating is, how familiar are you with each other. One thing that helps is at the beginning of a group life to set up some kind of group agreement about, how we engage together, how do we share the space. So there's some conversation about what those sort of norms and expectations are in a group. So that helps set a tone. Sometimes really directly within a group, you can respond and just say like, oh, hey, I've noticed that you've gotten to share and there's some other folks we haven't heard from, so maybe we can just leave a little bit of space for other people to share. Or it may be more appropriate at a break time to just sort of have a one-on-one conversation with that person. That can be hard for people if it hasn't, a safe space hasn't been set up to be sort of confronted in a group setting in front of other people. It can be publicly difficult for people. So sometimes just a one-on-one check-in, with our group, since we were getting to do this every day, we got to a pretty high comfort level with each other to be able to just, call someone on something when you think they need to be called on it. And we knew each other and trusted each other, to be able to know where that was coming from and the intentions, and to know what to watch for in each other. But it takes a while to build that level of trust with a group.
Right. What about introverts? Do you have some ways of dealing with people that just sit there and don't say anything the whole entire time, which can sometimes also leave you wondering what they're thinking if they're just sitting there not saying anything? Yeah,
and I think sometimes we have get into an extreme of trying to think that everyone has to share an equal amount of time all the time, and that's not natural, and that's not it's just not going to happen that way. But there are some things that we can do. One is sometimes it's an open discussion with a larger group. Sometimes you can break into smaller groups, which give people some more comfort level. Or in the large group, something we would do sometimes is just to say, I think we've reached a point where it'd be good to go around and hear. So we've had, there's 4 or 5 people who've been really engaging, and about, 10 people who are listening, and maybe they want to be listening. But at a certain point, you want to know what other people are thinking in the room. So you can even just say, we call it hitting the circle button. We're like, let's go around in a circle and just everyone share just a couple lines, a couple thoughts about what you're thinking. And sometimes that would really shift the conversation in a new direction. Sometimes that'd be helpful. We'd find out that there's 4 or 5 people who are really interested in this subject and 10 people who are completely checked out because this is totally uninteresting to them. But we didn't find that until we created space for that. I'm an extrovert. My job was trying to speak less in the classroom and choose carefully when I felt I really had something to contribute. But sometimes I would criticize myself for talking too much, and introverts would tell me, you know what, I'm really glad. I get uncomfortable when there's this pressure on introverts that we're supposed to have something to share. And if I have something to share, I'll share it. But sometimes I process inwardly, and and I need some extra time. Another thing about process is noticing that who's comfortable jumping in quickly, how quickly people process. And so there are those people who, as soon as a question is asked, they'll jump in. And often facilitators, if they put a question out there, can be uncomfortable with leaving too much silence. And sometimes we found we really needed to intentionally leave space, or sometimes ask, if there's anyone who hasn't spoken on this, and there would need to be, 10 seconds, 30 seconds, a minute of silence before someone was ready to speak and say, well, I'm thinking this. But they need that quiet time. If someone's talking, they can't quite assemble their thoughts. But if there's a little bit of quiet space, they can get their thoughts in order and then are ready to speak. But it does mean risking just leaving that empty space and trusting that that's an okay thing. We'd often say that, trying to read when a group's in silence, does that mean that people aren't engaged, or does that mean people are really deeply engaged? And it can be either, but I think often we make the assumption that if people aren't saying anything, people aren't engaged.
Yeah, that was something that took me a long time. I've been teaching at the post-secondary level for a long time, and that took me a really long time to learn, is that you can't just say, okay, does anybody have any questions? Great. Okay, let's all get on to the next subject, because you could see the wheels turning in some people. And if they're a little bit shy or a little bit less used to speaking up, so I have learned over the years to leave quite a bit of silence. And someone actually commented not that long ago and said, I noticed that you just be quiet for quite a long time and stand there looking at us, and it doesn't make me uncomfortable anymore. But at the beginning it did, because it was kind of a skill to learn, and to give yourself permission that it's okay to have silence, because we don't have a lot of silence in our world anymore. I don't think. Yeah. Do you notice anything, or have you learned anything different that you might have said, oh yeah, I used to do this, or I've done this before, that works really well, or something that you learned that, okay, I'm going to try it differently now?
There's a model that I learned that I think this was a really good opportunity to just watch and pay attention to this model being lived out, and to learn how to practice it. And it's the idea that there are sort of 3 things going on when we're in a group. There's the subject that we're focused on, there's the process that we're using, and there's the group life. And so it's, what is it that we're here to do? How are we doing it? And what's going on in the group? What's going on in the room? And I think the emphasis generally gets put on the subject, especially when you think of education situations. You come to a classroom, you're here to, learn about communication, and that can take the form of, a lecture, and, the emphasis is to learn that information. So a lecture and textbooks are, and essays are one example of a process. But looking at like, okay, is it going to be small group discussion? Are you going to, have people break off in pairs? Are they all going to be in pairs, or are you going to have one pair in the middle, demonstrating that? So just thinking through, if this is the subject we want to explore, what's the best way to explore that? And I think we see, we all have had examples of teachers who do that well and think of creative processes and think, when is a lecture the best way to learn something, and when is something more interactive or more physical using our bodies. But I think often the one that gets the least attention is the group life, what's going on in the room. And yet, so often people, if you think of down the road in a year after a class or after, a meeting or some workshop you're a part of, we have trouble remembering the subject of what we were talking about. And we might remember some of the process and what we did, but the thing we'll most remember is how it felt. And usually that's about what's going on in the group life. And you're like, I don't remember what we talked about, but I loved being part of that group. I always felt so good when I was with that group, or like, oh, I hated going to that class. It just felt awful. And whether it's about a learning environment or whether you're trying to accomplish a task, at a board meeting and make a decision, if we're not attending to the group life, then we could have the most interesting subject and a great process. But if there's other stuff going on in the room, we're not going to engage. We're going to be distracted. And that could be something as simple as, the room's really hot, or, people are tired, or it could be there's some dynamic going on that, two people had a big fight in the hallway and everyone overheard it and everyone's feeling a little tense and thinking about that. And then someone could be, facilitating some great, exciting subject in a great process, but people's minds are distracted. And sometimes it's hard to know what's going on, and sometimes to know how to respond to that. But I think having that on your radar and always asking the question, like, what's going on in the room right now? And if you're not sure, being willing to ask. I can think of one example where there was a group, we were on a break, and at the break time, one of the students got a phone call that a family member had died. And so when we came, all of a sudden, she came into the room crying, and it's those kind of situations where you it's in your face. You can't avoid. There's something going on in the room. You can't. It would obviously be ridiculous just to say, "Well, let's get back to it." And the facilitator handled it so well. It just all of a sudden the whole room was focused on that, and so she gave us space to all focus on that. It was a religious setting, so we were able to pray for the person and pray together, and it was handled so well that then we were able to say, okay, and now let's shift our focus, back to the task at hand. And we were able to do that because the group life had been tended to very well. And I think, sometimes that gets missed.
Yeah. So if you're not the facilitator, if you're just at a meeting and something's going on like that, is there anything that you can do to attend to group life if there's a problem? Are there things that you can do if you're not in charge of this group?
I think sometimes just asking the question, if you're noticing something going on, sometimes naming that something's going on, and it, again, it could be simple as, I think, we might be ready for a break, and I'd be able to focus more if we took 10 minutes right now. Might be a simple way of shifting that, or sometimes just asking a question. I remember being part of a group where a lot of people had strong feelings about one person in the group, but they weren't being said publicly. It was all happening in small conversations, and I didn't know how to bring that up, but was able to just say, I think there's a conversation here, and I don't know what it is. I don't know what this is, but I think we can't really talk about anything else until we talk about this. So I think as a participant, you don't have to take control of the situation. You don't have to be in charge of it. You don't have to figure it out. But either naming something that you see that maybe the facilitator isn't seeing, or asking a question. And sometimes it's helpful when it comes from a participant, and it doesn't always have to, it brings that responsibility to the participants as participants in the group life, rather than, well, if there's something to be dealt with, the facilitator's got to be the one to deal with it.
Yeah, it can be helpful to go back to those standards and norms that you said at the beginning too, if there's something going on. I was recently in a setting where a person's cell phone kept going off repeatedly, and nobody said anything, and it was a bit distracting, I think. And it would have been helpful had somebody said something. And particularly if the facilitator had said something at the beginning. But these things happen, and if I guess the group members aren't willing to step up and say something, then we all have to live with whatever the consequences are. What about energy? You talked about energy, and you can tell in a group when the energy is, I can tell at the front of the class when the energy is really, really low. And what have you got about that?
Sometimes there are just things you have no control over, but I think, again, sometimes just naming it, just noticing like, okay, we seem to be a little bit tired today, and willing to be flexible. I think when energy is low, we need to engage our bodies, and so finding a way. So, sometimes I've been in a group where I've just said, okay, and I think this is the next thing we need to talk about, but first everyone needs to change chairs, and just to mix it up. And you notice people, even just moving a chair, it shook them out of the little tired zone they were getting into, and they had to get used to being in a new space and sitting by someone else, and just woke them up a little bit. Sometimes something like a breathing exercise or a quick little game of something. It depends on the situation and who you're meeting with, what's going to be appropriate. It may be simply a break, and it may be, again, putting the question to the group. The facilitator doesn't have to be the expert, and there may be a reason for it that you don't know. I remember a friend saying she was tutoring someone, and he was having so much trouble learning, and she was working with him for 3 days, and she kept trying to figure out what she was doing wrong, and every day was coming with new exercises, new teaching materials, and different approaches, and none of it was working. And then she found out that this man had no food at home and was so hungry that he couldn't focus on the task. And so you can try and always solve the problem, but unless you're find out what the problem is, or you're willing to ask, you can try all the strategies you want, and and sometimes that's just not something one of the great things about in a group is you've got all these factors that can contribute to rich learning, and one of the challenges is you don't have control over all those factors.
Right, and if communication doesn't happen about that kind of stuff, then it's pretty difficult. Yeah. I remember having a student in the class who was hearing impaired, and she let us know that she was hearing impaired in the classroom and sat in the front, and we sort of did some lip reading and that kind of thing. But when she went out to her clinical experience in the hospital, she neglected to tell the preceptor that she had hearing aids, and she had two, but she had long hair, so you couldn't tell. And very quickly, I got a phone call as the supervisor that there was a communication issue going on, and they were both mad at each other. And I had to take them off into separate rooms and, have conversations. And of course, as a teacher, I was not allowed to disclose any personal information about a student, right? So finally, I figured out that the problem was she hadn't said that I can't hear unless you're standing in front of me. And the person that was trying to teach her on the hospital unit was giving her all sorts of information that she didn't hear because she was standing beside her or behind her or something. And so after a while, the preceptor said, well, she doesn't listen to anything I say, so I'm not going to talk anymore. And the student was saying, well, she's not telling me anything anymore. And they were at this horrible impasse. And this was day 3 or something of this, a 7-week experience where they had to work with one another. So when we finally figured out what the problem was, perhaps you would like to tell her, and she decided she would disclose it. And then they started over again, and it was all fine. But sometimes you don't have any control over stuff like that. What about with different ages? Are there any differences with ages and groups?
Yeah, definitely. And I think partly, as adults, our bodies have settled that we're able to, sit for longer periods of time, and that we've also been cultured that way. And definitely with children and youth, that's not always the case. And just keeping things more active and interactive. And often, if I've got an idea that like, oh, I want to teach this to a group of children, I'll often think it through in my sort of typical adult way. Well, I want to say this, and this. And then I realize, okay, and how would I, what of that could I ask in questions? What kind of activity could I do to explore that? What kind of like symbol or image or like item could I bring in to illustrate that? Because children and youth are not, they're honest, and they're not really willing to sit and listen to someone talk for too long, and they'll start to check out, and their bodies, as adults, we've learned to contain all that and be like, sit and be still, and like, but children and youth, you can just physically see them getting restless and their attention wandering. I think sometimes they have a lot to teach us about brevity and about sticking to what matters and being really alive and engaging about it. I think as adults, we're willing to resign ourselves to something that's less interesting because that's the way it is. But children and youth have higher standards about that. It better be engaging, or I'm out of here.
Yeah, I've heard that too. I heard a study not too long ago, or it wasn't a study, it was a guy who was doing theater review. He was doing a theater festival, and he decided to hire a bunch of 12-year-olds to go and review all these theater productions, because I think he was saying that the studies have shown that up to the age, and including the age of 12, there aren't the filters that adults have. And so these kids were brutally honest. This play was boring. This wasn't interesting. You didn't understand it, and they didn't, for me, if I'd been asked to be a theater reviewer, I would go and study instantly what a theater reviewer is all about and how they say it, and read a bunch of theater reviews so that I could just be like them. Right. Right. So, these kids would just go and be straight out honest. And so when you're dealing with kids rather than adults, there's probably different filters.
And I think it inspires us to be creative. Some of my most creative work is because I know that I've got to step up my game to keep them engaged. And often then what I find is that when you transfer that to adults are thrilled. Like I'll do something with a group of adults in a learning environment that I've done at a youth retreat, and the adults are just on fire. They're like, this is so great. We've never done anything like this before. And I'm like, oh, this is what we do all the time at youth group and youth conferences and stuff like that. And so I think we as adults want to be engaged. We want creative, active engagement. Sometimes we want to sit and listen and whatnot, but we want variety too. And brevity is good. Often when there's something that I want to learn about, the other day I was wanting to get an overview of different world religions, and going and finding a children's book about that. People do their work when they're communicating to children to get down to like what matters, how to say it clearly, and how to say it creatively. So I think we can let children and youth inspire how we communicate, but not just limit that to children and youth.
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice to go to some workshops and things that were a little more lively than some of the ones that we go to? Yeah. I know. I've also sat through painful groups at times where people aren't sticking to the agenda or sticking to the task at hand. And are there ideas for that, for moving along the program as a facilitator, I guess, that can be helpful? Because there are some people that don't know how to run meetings, and it's very painful to sit in those meetings. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's always a tough call too between sticking to the agenda and knowing, which tangents might lead to some creative outside the box thinking and which ones are just totally getting us off task. And sometimes you don't know till afterwards. When we, in this semester in dialogue program, we would have our dialogue with a guest in the morning, and then after lunch, we'd sit and debrief. And often then by looking back, we could say, oh, well, that was the moment where we got way off track. Or, oh, it started to go there, but then it took us into a whole new realm of thought that, and actually we were all pretty bored with the planned agenda or the sort of track that it was on. And so it's a tough call. So much about communication is being present, is about paying attention to what's going on. And And it's a balance of paying attention to how am I responding to this? Do I think this is on track or not? And paying attention to what's going on in the room. And sometimes I feel like, this is so not the way I want it to be going. But I look around and I see actually most of the group is really engaged with this. So first of all, it's a matter of reading, like, is this a helpful tangent or is this a distracting tangent? And then again, I think sometimes just putting it out to the group, asking the question, like, I just want to pause and ask if this is, the direction we started out talking about this. I think sometimes helping people track the trajectory is helpful. We started with this question and I noticed it's taken us off here. Do we want to continue with this question or do we want to bring it back to the direction we are on, and hearing what the group has to say about that? And I think also always holding at the heart of everything, what is the purpose? Like, why are we gathered here? And so bringing it back to, is this serving the purpose? Is this helping us learn about communication because that's what we came here to do? Or is this helping us, could this lead us to making a decision about this, financial situation on this board of directors?
Right. What about conflict? Have you done some stuff around conflict in your course?
Oh, yes. And I'm a great avoider of conflict.
You learned that, eh?
Yeah. And I think, conflict, it so depends on the situation it's in. Something I've noticed for myself is gaining clarity is the biggest thing. And if I'm clear about what the conflict's about, what the situation is, then it's a lot easier for me to be less reactive and more, responsive to say, like, okay, let's try and we have a shared understanding of what happened. Now we can actually look at where to go with this. I find it easier when a conflict is in a really specific moment. Like, you said this and I took offense to that. So let's revisit that and understand why that is. I think conflict gets more complicated when, it's an ongoing dynamic situation, and I can think of one group that I was meeting with, and sort of meeting by meeting, there were so many layers of dynamics going on that by the time, you really come to the head of the conflict, you can't unpack that over a short period of time, and it's hard to unpack that at all just to know where to start because it's a barrel of monkeys. So I think starting with clarity and slowing down when we hit conflict. Some of us can sort of ramp up when we hit conflict. There's a great story about a meat cutter who's this renowned meat cutter, and he gets asked, like, how do you cut your meat so beautifully? And he talks about his tools that he prepares and his sharp tools, but he also talks about his approach to cutting and just cutting through the meat. But when he reaches a gristly section in the meat, of just slowing down and going so slowly that and knowing that his tools are sharp enough that the knife will find its way. But if he tries to muscle through that in any way, the meat won't be cut properly. So I think in those icky, gristly moments that we hit where we can feel our stomach starting to tense up or emotions rising, that if we slow down, there's more chance, more ability to listen for the direction that things need to go, rather than our own ego or our own agenda of where we think it should go.
I think that's sage advice. That's good. That's so true. I think we're coming to the end of our time, but I was wondering if you had any book recommendations, any books that speak to you as far as group dynamics and things go.
The book that comes to mind isn't so much about communication or group dynamics per se, but it's by a man named Parker Palmer, and I always think of Parker Palmer as the greatest teacher that I have, who I've never met, but who teaches me so much. And he's got several books out, and books about discernment, and books about, he's got a book called The Active Life, which actually the story of the meat cutter came out of. But he's got a book called The Hidden Wholeness. And he talks about, the ways in which our lives become very divided in who we are and what we do, and his whole work is around connecting soul and role, connecting who we are with what we do, and he's sort of developed some processes around this, and some of it draws on other traditions that he's just sort of reshaped. And one of them is around called circles of trust, and it's a way of being in a group, and ways of using poetry and process and facilitation to help create a space where it's safe for people's soul to show up, where it's safe for people in a group setting to go to that level of personal reflection, which can be really difficult in a group setting, but it is kind of that process. Once we get to that connected, soulful place, we may come with all kinds of questions and struggles about our lives, but how to create a group setting that allows us to bring all of that and go to that soul-connected place where the way forward becomes clear.
Yeah, those are the powerful kinds of groups to be in, right? Whether it's a book club or any kind of a setting that where you can get to that deeper level is great. Good, and I will put a link to that on the show notes at www.communicationdiva.com for the book A Hidden Wholeness. And I just want to thank you, Wade, for taking time today out of your busy student life to have this conversation with me today. I think it's been very enriching, and I think people will really appreciate the things you've had to say.
Awesome. You're welcome, Jen. Thanks for having me.
So that was my interview with theology student Wade Lifton here at the Vancouver School of Theology. And I want to thank you for listening to the Communication Diva podcast. Next week's episode will be with featured guest Anita Bloy, who is a family therapist who has a private practice. And she will be discussing couples communication and how couples work with one another and some of the issues around that and some of the things that she does to help couples work through any problems that they might be having. So stay tuned for that. And remember, all of the show notes and Wade's book recommendation will be on the website at www.communicationdiva.com. I hope that you come over and say hello and leave a comment about the episode that you heard. Like me on Facebook or join my Twitter feed at Jen Swanson 2, Jen Swanson 2 on Twitter. I would love to hear from you and hear what you think so far about Communication Diva and everything that goes on here. Thanks for listening and have a fantastic day.